As soon as we dip into this point, all hell breaks loose. Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So there's some new shocking footage that has come out of India that is showing the country descend into chaos. People are fighting over oxygen containers. People are fighting with the doctors. There's a new black market for oxygen, and a lot of stuff is going down that is not being seen in the media. I'm going to talk about the actual video that I'm referencing later in this video, so be sure to stick around for that. But what we need to understand is that we were almost there as a society, and I want to break this down for you today, why what happened there didn't happen here. And it's in large part due to the fact that we skirted the line of failure in terms of the amount of resources that we had. So we're going to talk about how we descend into the proverbial SHTF after a disaster scenario. So on this graph, we have time on the x-axis, and then we have resources on the y-axis. Now, during peacetime, theoretically, resources should be high, or as high as they're going to be at any given time. Now, after disaster strikes, what happens is resources, because of supply chain disruptions, inevitably are going to go down. The supply chain is going to be compromised. As we've seen last year, a pandemic is a perfect example of this because less people are going to work. We have to shut down certain services. And usually in the first phase of this, the resources that get shut down are going to be those things which aren't essential. So first thing to go is the non-essential resources. We all are familiar with the term non-essential worker. Not many of us like the term. I don't like the term, but for the sake of explaining this, we need to use the term. Then we have those more essential commodities. What are essential commodities? Food, medicine, water, and to an extent, security and shelter. Non-essential things are television sets, movie theaters, luxuries that you don't necessarily need to survive, but they're there to improve the quality of life. These are going to be the first things to go in a disaster situation. Now, there's going to be an inverse relationship with crime and resource availability. And this is very similar to game theory, if you're familiar with that. So crime is going to increase as resources become less abundant. Now, what happens at this point here is very, very critical. In India right now, they have reached a point where essential commodities are not being provided. When you are seeing your loved one gasping for air, and you know that there is a way that you can save that person's life, what would you do in that particular situation? Many people would do anything to be able to save the life of a person that they love. For that reason, hell is breaking loose in many parts of the country. Essential services like oxygen, probably one of the most fundamental things that you need to survive. You know, you can only survive a few minutes without air. Everybody knows the rule of threes. 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. So what happens when you cross this Rubicon? So remember, this is crime, okay? Now, India, we're not seeing looting, right? We've seen looting in the United States and in some other parts of the world. Now, that was largely driven by external factors, the George Floyd situation. But you could make an argument that there was some socioeconomic impetus to that as well. But we never got to the point where people were starving, where they didn't have medicine or proper medical equipment. Remember, there was a scare, there was a concern that it could go there. There was a concern that we wouldn't have the proper personal protective equipment, that we wouldn't have the ventilators, that we wouldn't have the oxygen masks, but there was this mass mobilization to produce those things. So we were able to avoid this situation right here that we're going to talk about in a minute, because this is very critical. If this situation were to have happened in the United States of America, of all places, the hell that would have been unleashed when a generation of people who've been largely entitled in a predominantly individualistic society, okay, when someone, particularly a loved one, cannot get oxygen to breathe, and you are in a society where everybody owns a gun, can you imagine the hell that might be unleashed? Fortunately, we didn't get there. We never crossed this line. We actually skipped off of it. Okay, so this is the trajectory that they had in the United States. However, in India, the trajectory, they've broken through this line. This is what I would call the point of fatal peril. And there's an inflection point with crime at this point. You'll notice the curve now becomes almost logarithmic. So crime steadily increases as time goes on and resources become more scarce. But as soon as resources become so scarce that it starts dipping into the essential, this is a scarcity of essential commodities. As soon as we dip into this point, all hell breaks loose. Now, I'm not sure if the military and the authorities are aware of this, but I'm pretty sure they are. I'm pretty sure they understand that at this point where people cannot eat, where people cannot get the medicine they need to save their loved ones, or where people cannot get proper water, or even ensure proper security, what happens here is not only does crime continue to go up, but you'll notice that crime is going to go up exponentially. Why is that? Because of the simple fact that as crime increases, the ability to generate resources decreases even more. There's an inflection point that happens once you cross that line where people no longer have the essential services they need. That's when social disintegration truly begins. And that's why I believe when they talk about the importance of flattening the curve, this is what the authorities truly feared. They feared that we would get to a point where for whatever reason there'd be so many sick people, or we wouldn't have enough resources to treat sick people. And once you start getting concerned family members who have grown up in a society where, for the most part, I know there's issues with the healthcare system there, but for the most part, you will get the help you need, okay? If you're dying, you will get the help you need. If you are deprived of that for whatever reason, because of resource scarcity, and you know that the stuff you need to keep your people alive exists there, but it's just not for you, it's for somebody who can afford to pay for it, that's when the system truly starts to break down, and we see it descend into the chaos that we are now seeing in India. So what did we see? We seen looting. What we didn't see was crossing this line was actual violence. We seen violence, but it largely revolved around this. Okay, there was points where we touched this with civil unrest. And obviously it was a powder keg of activity because you had right and the left, it was an election year, all that stuff. So this whole graph was somewhat skewed by those variables in the equation. But we've seen looting, which is in large part due to socioeconomic deprivation. If people don't have what they want, they are going to loot clothing stores, electronic stores. If people don't have what they need, that's when people get violent. And it's not even because people are necessarily doing this with malicious intent. It's just that when you have a need and someone is standing in between you and that need, that's when violence happens. So what do we do then as a society to prevent this dissent? Well, what we do, something called EROL. This is what preppers call excessive rule of law. They try to regulate the hell out of the situation to ensure that we don't get to this point right here. Because remember, once we cross this point, and I made this point last year, right when this whole thing was starting in March of 2020, I said that the reason why they're coming in as heavy-handed as possible is because they know that once we cross this point, it becomes very hard to control the situation. Once you get past the point where you do not have the essential items that people need in order to survive, they are going to do whatever it takes, lockdown or not, to acquire those goods and services. Excessive rule of law kicks in. What did that look like? Well, at the high point of all this, there was military in the streets. Remember that. In many cities around the United States, there was essentially martial law. Now, I know not martial law in the legal sense of the word, but when you have the National Guard and the military in the streets, to me, that's getting pretty close. It's skirting the line. Obviously, it's not a textbook definition of martial law, but that's essentially what happened in order to avoid a descent into chaos. Because remember, once we hit this point, people stop working, people start fighting in the streets, the economy slows down, okay? It becomes progressively harder to pull out of that depression. Fortunately, we did not cross the Rubicon of fatal peril. We skipped off of it, in large part due to the excessive rule of law, what most of us found to be excessive. But had that not happened, our society could have potentially devolved into violence. This is why I think the authorities have taken such a heavy-handed approach throughout this whole pandemic, because it's a real slippery slope. Once you lose control, you really lose control. Okay, it's like flying an airplane. In order to keep the airplane in the air, everything must be working properly. One little thing, one little slip up behind the wheel, it becomes harder and harder to fix the plane and course correct and do whatever you have to do to get out of that situation, the closer the plane gets to the ground. So it's an exponential effect, and the authorities feared this. And the video in question I'm talking about, I'm going to write the title of it on the screen here, and you're going to see what is happening. And just remember that this is just one of many incidents that are currently occurring in the country.
Unfortunately, during the time I was making this video, the video in question was taken down and the account that posted it was terminated. The video essentially showed patients fighting with doctors for supplies. Unfortunately, I cannot find this video anymore, and I can anecdotally say that there does appear to be some suppression of independent voices coming out of India. But that is just my own speculation and not necessarily an objective fact.
It's very obvious to everybody that the true death toll is being suppressed, and just be grateful that we didn't get to this point of fatal peril, because it easily could have happened, and it could very well happen in the future, and we need to be prepared for this. We are already starting to see us go back down this line with respect to supply chain disruptions. Okay, we're starting to see non-essential goods and services, the price of those things go up. We're starting to see inflation. Everybody knows it's coming. And even scarier than that is that in addition to the increased cost of goods and services, we're also seeing the dollar decline. And it's dramatic. The only question is, What's going to happen next? And what are you going to do to prepare for when we get to this point in the future? We were lucky to avoid this, but we may not be so lucky in the future. You can look at places like Venezuela, Argentina, and now of course India. Places which cross that line, okay, where essential goods and services were not being produced for their population. And the scariest thing to me about this whole pandemic situation, and I've said this for years, is that no country wants to admit defeat. And as such, countries will always downplay. They'll always downplay the extent of the virus within their own borders, so not to compromise their place on the global stage. Go and watch the video I made 5 years ago. I said that very thing, and it played out to a T in this pandemic. And it's playing out to a T again in India, where the numbers are being suppressed, the true numbers. Okay, you're talking about people fighting for oxygen tanks. You're talking about people getting oxygen in their vehicles in 40-degree temperatures. Could you imagine the chaos that would be unleashed in the United States if you had similar conditions in our society? Could you imagine the hell that would be unleashed? It would not be like a Hollywood film where the good guy lives and he slays all the zombies. Chances are you are going to get burned. I'm probably going to get burned. We're all going to get burned. But we need to do what we can to prepare for it. Thanks for watching, guys. Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll try to get to as many as I can, but I can't make any promises. Thanks for watching. Canadian Peril.